The phone rang at the least expected moment. I was stuck in traffic. The radio on in the background when my husband's voice broke the monotony. "Dad is not okay, can you stop by his house? I will be there later." His tone was so cold, so distant, as if he were just doing a duty. I hung up the phone, but my mind did not clear. Instead, something inside me tensed, and then the second message came this time. It was his father, my father-in-law. I could barely understand him between his gasps, but his words were clear. "Lorena, help me." I left the car on the sidewalk without thinking twice and ran down a narrow street, lined with old trees. The wind was blowing hard, but I barely felt it. My aunt's heart was racing. When I got to his door, I found it half open. When I entered, I saw him. He was on the floor, barely breathing, with an expression that mixed pain and resignation. "What happened to you?" My voice came out broken, more from fear than exhaustion from the race. I tried to lift him up, but I had no strength. He could only mutter "thank you" while I tried to find a little composure. It was not the first time I had seen him vulnerable, but this time it felt different. The urgency of the situation filled the air, but at the same time, there was something else in that moment, something that I could not identify, something that made my skin crawl. I helped him lie down on the couch, and while I did so, our eyes met for a second. Too long. There was something in his gaze that I did not understand at that moment, but that left me with a feeling of uneasiness that did not disappear even when I returned home that night. That instant, that simple call for help had marked the beginning of something that would change my life forever. The visits to my father-in-law's house became more frequent. Every afternoon after work, I arrived at that old home that over time had begun to feel like a second home. I often found him sitting in his armchair with the television on, but not really paying attention to it. There was something in the atmosphere of that place, a calm that contrasted with the chaos of my daily life. One afternoon, when I finished preparing dinner for him, I headed towards the door to leave. I had already started to say goodbye when he called me from the armchair. "Lorena." His voice sounded soft, almost shy. "Thank you for everything you do for me. I don't know what I would do without you." I stopped dry. There was something in his tone, something that made me turn around and approach again. I sat next to him, thinking that he just wanted to thank me once again, but his look was different, as if he were trying to say something else. In an unexpected gesture, he took my hand in his, something that he had never done before. "Your husband is a lucky man," he murmured, and suddenly, with a gentle movement, he leaned towards me. I felt the warmth of his face approaching mine, and before I could process it, his lips brushed mine. For a second, I walked away, immediately, completely bewildered. "No, we shouldn't," I stammered, unable to find the right words. He just nodded with a look that revealed as much regret as I wish. I left hurriedly, my mind spinning endlessly, unable to understand what had just happened. After that incident, my head kept going over and over what had happened. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself that it had just been a misunderstanding, a moment of weakness. However, something had changed. The visits to my father-in-law's house, they were no longer the same. Every time he arrived, I felt a tension in the air, a kind of invisible barrier that neither of us wanted to cross. Meanwhile, at home, things continued to slowly crumble. My husband was more absent than ever, caught up in his work and his own worries. The few times we met at home, the conversations were short, almost automatic. "How is my father?" he asked me without taking his eyes off his computer or phone. "It seems better that he is recovering," he answered, but deep down I knew I was not referring only to his physical health. The time he spent with his father was not just an obligation. It was beginning to become an escape, a routine where I felt appreciated. One night, I dared to break the silence that had settled between us. "You realize that we barely talk. It seems like we live separate lives, as if we were no longer a couple." My voice sounded more desperate than I expected. He looked up, surprised by my comment, but his response was cold, almost indifferent. "I've been very busy, Lorena. I don't have time for these things now." And he focused on his screen again. That phrase hit me like a slap. It wasn't just the words, but the tone, the disinterest in his eyes. I realized that I had lost something in our marriage, something essential that I no longer knew how to recover. At my father-in-law's house, instead, things were different. Although the atmosphere was charged with a strange Mixture of emotions, at least there was a connection. He looked at me in a way that made me feel seen, something that I did not experience with my husband, since this confused me even more. I knew I was playing with fire, that what had happened should not be repeated. But the emptiness I felt at home pushed me into that dangerous terrain again and again every time I saw my husband. So absorbed in his work, so oblivious to what was happening in our lives, I felt more alone, and in that loneliness I found solace in the small moments that I spent in that old and dusty house, where time seemed to stop and the barriers between right and wrong began to blur. One afternoon when I arrived at my father-in-law's house, I found him standing next to a box of tools, something I had never seen in all the time I had spent taking care of him. "What are you doing?" I asked with a smiled, surprised to see him out of his usual chair. "I thought about making some fixes around here. This place needs it. And well, it is also my way of thanking you for everything you have done," he said with a tone more animated than I had heard him in weeks. I didn't know what to respond to seeing him so active. Gave me back a sense of normality that had been absent for a while. He offered to help me, and together we began to move some old things and dusty that had accumulated years of disuse. After a while we were choosing the paint color for one of the rooms. He seemed interested in every detail, as if he were holding on to that small renovation as a symbol of something bigger. As we painted one of the walls, he asked me, "Have you realized how much you have done for me, Lorena? Without you, I don't know how I would have continued going forward. You are my only company these days." His comment left a lump in my throat, not only from the words but from the weight of his sincerity. I tried to divert the conversation, but he didn't allow it. "No, seriously, what you and I have is special, you know that, right?" I felt my heart speed up. No, we shouldn't talk about it," I replied, trying to downplay it. "But you know it," he insisted, his gaze fixed on mine. "You know this is more than just a father-in-law and daughter-in-law relationship. We have been through a lot together." The words echoed in my mind as we continued painting in silence. It was as if each brushstroke was loaded with a new layer of tension. I knew I had to leave, but I couldn't leave the project half finished. My excuse was as fragile as the wall we were covering with fresh paint. Finally, when we finished, it was getting late and I was about to leave. He walked me to the door, and just before I could turn the handle, his hand brushed mine. It was a soft gesture, almost imperceptible, but that left me motionless for a moment. It wasn't like the last time. It wasn't an impulsive movement this time. His touch was more intimate, more calculated. "Lorena," murmured. The way he said my name made everything inside me stop for a second. "Really, we shouldn't," I tried to say, but I couldn't finish the sentence. There were no words that could stop what happened next. A few days passed before I returned to my father-in-law's house. I knew I was entering dangerous territory, but every time I tried to avoid thinking about it, an inexplicable force dragged me back. The renovation project was my perfect excuse. It was just work, I repeated to myself over and over, trying to convince myself that nothing had changed. That afternoon when I arrived, the atmosphere in the house was different. The air was heavy, but not because of the heat or the dust floating in the rooms, but because of an invisible tension that I had not felt before. My father-in-law was sitting in the dining room looking through some old photos. He greeted me with a smile, but something in his gaze made me feel that we both knew what was coming. "Do you continue with the painting?" he asked me in a casual tone, although in his eyes I saw a depth that I could not ignore. "Pray, yes. I want to finish that wall in the living room," I answered, trying to sound natural. But as we walked towards the living room, the silence between us grew denser. I knew that the moment was near. I knew that this silence was not only discomfort, was the prelude to something more. We began to work in the living room, each on his side, without saying anything for a while. Every now and then our arms brushed as we moved the furniture, but neither of us made a comment about it. The silence was deafening, and then when we had already made quite a bit of progress, I stopped for a while. Moment tired of so much effort. He did the same, and for a moment we just stood there facing each other without speaking. Lorena began to say in a low voice. I turned to him, but I couldn't hold his gaze for long. I knew what was coming. "You know, we can't keep pretending," he continued, taking a step towards me. "Please, let's not continue down this path," I said in a whisper, although my words didn't have the strength they needed. My inside was divided between what I knew I should do and what I had unintentionally started to feel. He took one more step, and before I could process it, he was at my side. There were no words or justifications. What happened was as unexpected as inevitable. He approached slowly, and in an almost imperceptible movement his lips touched mine. It wasn't like the first time. It wasn't an impulsive or clumsy gesture this time. It was different. There was a pause, a brief moment in which time seemed to stop. It was a kiss that did not need to be explained or prolonged, because we both knew that we had crossed a line from which there was no turning back. I moved away. Instantly my hands trembled, but I did not say anything. He neither did. The silence that surrounded us was no longer the same as before. Now it was full of something that we could not and did not want to undo. We stayed there motionless, looking at each other, aware that everything had changed. In that instant, without another word, I took my things and left, knowing that I would never be the same after that day. My life was filled with awkward silences and disordered thoughts. I knew that I had made a mistake, that what happened should not have happened. I tried to convince myself that I could ignore it, leave it behind, but it was impossible. Every thought returned to that moment in the living room, to that kiss that had changed everything. I tried to continue with my routine, pretend that nothing had happened, but the weight of the guilt grew bigger with each passing day. The visits to my father-in-law's house became even more tense. Each time I crossed the threshold of that door, I felt a strange mix of discomfort and expectation. He was always there, waiting for me, but we never mentioned what had happened. It was as if we had both decided to leave that moment in the past without saying it, although we both knew we couldn't. Each conversation, each look was loaded with what was not said. One day when I arrived, I found him in the kitchen making coffee. His face seemed calmer than usual, as if he had made peace with what had happened. I instead couldn't find that calm. I approached slowly, trying to pretend that everything was okay. Coffee, he asked with a smile, as if nothing had changed between us. Yes, thank you, I answered, although in my mind I kept thinking about how I should behave, how I should act so as not to make everything more awkward than it already was. We sat in the table, each one with his cup. The silence was overwhelming. Each swig of coffee seemed to last an eternity. I couldn't look him in the eyes, not after what had happened, but at the same time something inside me sought his gaze, his approval, his "Sorry, Lorena," he said, finally breaking the silence. "We can't go on like this." His voice was calm but firm. "I know this is complicated, but we need to talk about what happened." I felt my heart racing. I wasn't ready for this conversation. I didn't know what to say. "I don't know what that was. I don't know what we're doing," I answered, unable to hide my confusion. "Neither do I," he said, looking at his cup as if he were searching for the right words. "But I know we can't pretend that nothing happened, and I know what happened wasn't a mistake." His words hit me hard. It wasn't a mistake to me. It was quite the opposite. But part of me knew he was right. There was something more between us, something neither of us had wanted to admit until now. It wasn't just the kiss. It was everything that had been growing in silence for weeks, months, maybe more. "This isn't right," I said finally, looking up and meeting his eyes for the first time in what seemed like an eternity. "We can't do this to my husband. We can't go on like this." He nodded, but no, he seemed convinced. "I know, but I can't ignore what I feel, and I know you can't either." We fell silent again, both aware that the situation was unsustainable. We knew that sooner or later everything would come to light and the consequences would be devastating, but at that moment neither of us was ready to make a decision. The day that I feared finally arrived, after weeks of living in a state of constant tension, trying to ignore the inevitable. My husband began to notice the changes, although he had never been someone who paid too much attention to the details of our relationship. This time, something made him suspicious. Perhaps it was my constant absence at home, or the fact that every time he tried to talk to me I avoided his questions. The truth is that his gaze had become sharper, as if he were searching for answers that he didn't know how to formulate. One night when I came home after a long visit to his father's house, I found him sitting on the couch with the phone in his hand, staring at me. The television was on, but he wasn't watching it. I stood motionless at the door, surprised to see him there, since he usually was out late for work. Something in his expression made me feel a Panic. Lorena said. Her voice was calm but full of something I couldn't identify immediately. Can we talk? My heart began to beat hard. I felt like everything I had been trying to avoid was about to come to the surface. I approached slowly, not knowing how I was going to handle the situation. What's wrong? I asked, trying to stay calm. Something is wrong, he replied bluntly. Lately, I notice you're distant. You're not the same. And I'm not stupid. I know something is going on. His words made me feel like the ground beneath my feet was crumbling. I tried to think of an excuse and an explanation that could calm him down, but there was none. There was no way to disguise the truth without it being noticed. What you're talking? I replied, although I knew my attempt to divert the subject wasn't going to work. He knew me well enough to know when I was lying. You've been seeing someone? He asked more directly. His voice was not aggressive, but the pain in his eyes was unmistakable. I stayed silent, unable to answer immediately. I did not know what to say. On one hand, I wanted to deny, pretend that everything was fine and that he was just imagining things, but on the other hand, I knew that deep down I had already lost him. He no longer trusted me, and that was something I could not change with words. It is complicated, you murmur, because this, he said with a sadness that pierced me. I just wanted to hear it from you. I wanted to give you the chance to be honest. Tears began to fill my eyes. I knew that everything was about to fall apart, that there was no turning back. It was not something planned. I tried to explain, although I did not even know how to justify what had happened. I did not want it to happen, but it happened. He finished the sentence for me. He got up from the sofa and walked to the window, turning his back to me. The silence that followed was unbearable. I knew that he was processing everything, and not I knew if I should say something or just wait. After what seemed like an eternity, he turned to me. It's with my father, right? His tone was so calm that for a moment I thought I hadn't heard right. My heart stopped. I couldn't believe he had guessed that he somehow knew the truth without me telling him. I didn't answer right away, but the silence was enough to confirm what he feared. I knew something weird was going on between you. He continued, his voice still calm, although his eyes reflected a mix of disbelief and betrayal. I noticed it a long time ago, but I didn't want to believe it. I didn't want to think that you could do something to me like that. I couldn't hold back the tears. More. I'm sorry, I whispered, knowing that those words weren't enough, that they never would be. He closed his eyes for a moment, as if trying to process the pain he was feeling. I don't know how we got to this, Lorena. I don't know at what moment everything broke, but this doesn't have arrangement. Truth, I don't know, I admitted, feeling completely helpless. I didn't know how we had gotten there, how we had let everything fall apart like this, but I knew he was right. There was no turning back. I'm going to stay at a friend's house for a while, he finally said, his voice barely a whisper. I need space. I don't know what I'll do later, but I can't stay here. I saw him quietly gather his things, and in that moment I knew I had lost everything. What had been ours, our home, our life together, was falling apart before my eyes, and there was nothing I could do to stop him as he walked out the door alone in the middle of the silence, aware that my life would never be the same. The silence in my father-in-law's was thicker than usual. The walls seemed to absorb every noise, every thought that floated between us. I knew this visit would be different, that I couldn't keep prolonging the inevitable. For weeks I had tried to ignore what I felt, what had happened, but there was no turning back. Not after everything we had destroyed. When I arrived, he was waiting for me in the same chair, the same place where it had all started. There was no smiles nor gestures of familiarity, only looks full of resignation. I approached slowly, feeling the weight of our actions on my shoulders. I knew this would be the last time. Lorena, he began with a tired voice. No, we can continue like this. I did not answer without hesitating. This has to end. We have gone too far. We remained in silence for a few moments, both lost in our thoughts. I felt like each unspoken word accumulated between us, making the atmosphere more dense, harder to breathe. I'm sorry, he said suddenly, with a tone I did not expect. For everything, I never wanted things to come to this. His excuse me hit me with unexpected force. I knew that it had been him who took the first step, but I also knew that I had followed him. There were no innocents in this. We both had fallen into the same. You are not alone, I said in a low voice. I also allowed it. We both crossed a line that we should not have his eyes of. Regret be with mine, and for a moment all the chaos in you seemed to dissipate, but it only lasted a moment. My son, he knows it right? He asked, although I already knew the answer. His voice was full of guilt, not only for what we had done, but for what this would mean for his relationship with his own son. I nodded, unable to say more. I knew that revelation weighed on him as much as it did on me. But more so, his family relationship was at stake, in ours, whatever it had been, had no future. I think it is best that we do not see each other again, I said, finally feeling like each word tore me apart inside. It was not just the need to end our forbidden relationship, it was accepting that we had reached a point of no return. Maybe you are right, he murmured without looking at me, but in his voice there was something else, something that made me stop. What is wrong? I asked, although I was afraid to know the answer. The silence that followed was unbearable. He finally looked up and looked at me with an intensity that I had not seen before. Lorena, there is something that I haven't. He told you. My heart skipped a beat. Something in his tone put me on alert. What is it? I insisted, my voice shaking more than I would have liked. He took a breath, slowly, as if he was gathering the courage to speak. Your husband, he knows more than you think. It wasn't by accident that he found me out. I felt a bump in my throat. What do you mean? I asked, not sure if I really wanted to know the answer. He's known for longer than you can imagine, and what's worse, he told me before he even suspected it. For a second the words floated in the air without me being able to process them. Immediately my mind was filled with questions, but none found a coherent way out. How was it possible? What did that mean? Why hadn't he told me before? Why didn't you mention it to me? I whispered, feeling the betrayal seeping into every word. Because I thought that if you knew, you would leave. I thought that our thing wouldn't survive if you realized that he was playing his own game. I felt like reality was collapsing around me. Everything I thought I knew had become irrelevant in an instant. My husband had known everything from the start. I had let this happen for some reason I still didn't understand. But why? I asked, finally feeling the abyss open under my feet. Why would he do such a thing? He slowly stood up, his gaze fixed on mine, but there were no answers in his eyes, just more questions, more uncertainty. That's something you'll have to figure out for yourself. I left that house with more doubts than when I had arrived. My husband had allowed it. Why hadn't I faced it head on? The pieces didn't fit. As the cold afternoon wind enveloped me, I knew my life would never be the same.